Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Lori Ebenstein and this is Ethan Shire. We're both members of the Executive Council of the American Enterprise Institute, AEI at Brown. AEI at Brown is a group that started on campus last year and is affiliated with the national think tank American Enterprise Institute. Our mission is to facilitate campus discussion around a variety of key policy issues and to promote the competition of ideas on campus. Given the divisive rhetoric in today's world, AEI at Brown has partnered with the Watson Institute to bring in two prominent and influential figures. We would like to thank everyone at the Watson Institute for their support, specifically Catherine Dunkelman and Christy Kilgus. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors, Brown Democrats and Brown Republicans. We are very excited for today's discussion, Politics Policy in the Era of Trump, with Neera Tanden and Ramesh Ponnuru. Neera Tanden is the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress and the Center for American Progress Action Fund, where she focuses on how the organizations can expand opportunity for all Americans. Tanden received her Bachelor of Science from UCLA and her law degree from Yale Law School. Tanden has served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, and she has worked on presidential and senatorial campaigns. She has previously served as senior advisor for health reform at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In that role, she worked with Congress and stakeholders on particular provisions of the Affordable Care Act. Prior to that, Tanden was the director of domestic policy for the Obama-Biden presidential campaign and the policy director for Hillary Clinton's first presidential campaign. She was named to Elle Magazine's Women in Washington Power List and Politico Magazine's Politico 50, an annual list of the top thinkers, doers, and visionaries in American politics.
Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor for National Review, a columnist for Bloomberg View, a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. Ponnuru graduated summa cum laude from Princeton with a degree in history. Ponnuru has published articles in numerous newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. He has appeared on numerous television news programs and appears regularly as a guest on PBS NewsHour and Face the Nation. Today's discussion is streaming live and will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have another 45 minutes for questions. We are very fortunate to have Brown's own Ed Steinfeld to facilitate today's conversation. Professor Steinfeld is the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, a professor in the Political Science Department, and director of the China Initiative. Steinfeld has served as a consultant to the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and a variety of governmental agencies, NGOs, and multinational firms. Steinfeld received his PhD in political science from Harvard University. I have been fortunate to take two courses with Professor Steinfeld, and I'm excited he was able to join us today. We are hoping today's conversation will be both productive and informative. Now, please join me in welcoming Ramesh Ponnuru, Neera Tanden, and Ed Steinfeld.
Thanks so much, Lori and Ethan, and thanks especially Ramesh and Neera for joining us today. Let me just say something quickly about my own views regarding academic freedom. To me, academic freedom, most fundamentally, is about rational discourse, rational debate in some cases, about a variety of different ideas, discussion that's empirically grounded, and that discussion that often stems from a variety of different kinds of worldviews and political and social priorities. The purpose of the discussion today is really to be just that, a discussion, not a debate, and not even necessarily a competition of ideas. But I think each of the panelists today, Neera and Ramesh, they certainly don't represent a party, but they do come from different philosophical traditions. A conservative tradition, a progressive tradition, both of which are solidly in the American tradition, and both of which offer interesting insights. The traditions, and of course the individuals, offer interesting and important insights into the most pressing policy issues of our day. So what I thought I would do is I'll begin with a few questions just to encourage discussion, and we'll talk for a little while, and then we're going to open it up to you all. So please think of some questions as we move along. And just the last thing, for those of you standing in the back or sitting on the sides, we really do have seats up front. So don't be embarrassed. Please come down and fill the seats. Okay, well, if it's okay with you both, let's begin with a little bit of a policy discussion. And I thought the policy we would begin with is maybe one that's receiving the most attention, has been receiving the most attention in the last couple of days. The presidential executive order of a week and a half ago, suspending immigration for 90 days from 7 predominantly Muslim nations, and also suspending the U.S. refugee program for 120 days. I'm not asking you to say good or bad or to take a particular position on the executive order. I'm sure you both are. But there are a couple of features of the executive order that I'd like you to discuss. So first, the use of executive power. Not unique to this administration for sure, but this represents a dramatic use of executive power. And how should we think about that? What are different ways of thinking about this type of executive power, the use of executive power generally? Second, the issuance of this executive order came in the context of statements during the campaign by the president regarding a Muslim ban. And how should we think about that, and how do we make sense of the statements and the actual executive order? Third, there's a separate contextual issue about people surrounding the president, particularly the National Security Advisor, who has been quoted as suggesting that Islam is a political ideology rather than a religion, which suggests an approach that would remove protection from the Establishment Clause for Islam, for Muslims. So the question is how, maybe Ramesh, we'll start with you, how from a conservative perspective should we think about the interaction of those issues, at least as they come together for the executive order?
Well, I think that an unbalanced executive, an executive that has amassed too much power, is a serious problem in our government, and it's a problem that is perhaps more easily appreciated when somebody you dislike or oppose is in office. And so we had a lot of conservative complaints about presidential power under Obama, and the shoe is currently on the other foot. I think immigration is an area where presidents do tend to have a lot of legal latitude, and I think this administration is pushing that latitude, and I wouldn't be surprised, although so many of my predictions over the last 18 months have been proven false, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up in a situation where the president's power is a little bit curtailed because what had been an open question ends up getting forced, and the courts end up articulating a limit to that power. Part of the reason I suspect that's going to happen is that this was not a well thought through order. Trump made his promise during the campaign to have a ban on Muslim immigration. Nowadays, I suppose we're not supposed to even say ban, or sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't, depending on how Sean Spicer feels on any given day.
I think the more important question is whether Trump has tweeted that morning.
Right, yeah, whether Trump is watching the briefing. This executive order, I think, doesn't bear a rational relation to improving American security. I think it makes sense only in the context of trying to save face and make good on a campaign promise in a relatively legally and politically defensible way. That's how I think they ended up with this order. They did it in a very haphazard and not terribly competent way, and I suspect they're going to get slapped down as a result. On the general question of whether we should have a Muslim ban, pretty much the day that Trump announced this policy, I wrote that I thought that this was a serious mistake. I do think that there is a kind of naive rhetoric in which Islam has nothing at all to do with the problem of political violence and terrorism. And I think on the other side, there is a kind of a rhetoric that Trump himself is more likely to indulge in which the world's Muslims are all a threat and a danger. And I think what we need to have a more balanced perspective in which, look, there is a subset There is a small fraction of Muslims around the world who do think that their religion licenses political violence, killing of apostates, etc. And then there is a slightly larger subset of them who are willing to tolerate that point of view. We have to recognize that reality, but at the same time, it would be extraordinarily counterproductive to push all of the peaceful and peace-loving Muslims into the camp of being with them because we have decided that they're all the enemy.
Yeah, Neera?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in many ways I agree with Ramesh. We probably have some slight disagreements, but I think fundamentally the challenge for the Trump administration is that it does not actually have a consistent view on the issue of terrorism. So just in the last 48 hours, the administration put forward acts of terror that were not covered. All of those acts of terror were conducted by Muslims. None of the acts of terror that were done by white supremacists or against Muslims, like the most recent episode we just had in Quebec, not on the list. Dylan Roof, not on the list. And so I think that adds to the concern of progressives and many conservatives who see this issue as one that will ultimately make America less safe. I take note of the fact that it was George W. Bush who was a strong proponent of the idea that the United States should never articulate a case where we are basically saying all Muslims are bad or the Muslim religion is the enemy, because that, as George Bush said, and many Democrats have said, would actually play in the hands of extremists and terrorist groups like ISIS, who, just to be clear, over the last 10 days or so, have been using Donald Trump's Muslim ban as a recruitment tool. And so I think the challenge for this, and I agree with Ramesh that it was not properly thought through, and you saw Secretary Kelly today saying he should have slowed down this process. There were fundamental questions raised by the process in which it seems like Steve Bannon has more say than cabinet secretaries. And I think this is an area in which the Trump White House, which has very few people who have ever served in government and frankly has evinced a kind of denigration of people who are, who have actually served before. We're trying to rush something through, and we're seeing that they created a big opposition. And what I would say, I'm particularly heartened by is the fact that you've seen people throughout the country, not just on the coast, but in Nashville, in Louisville, there are large-scale protests defending the idea that the United States is a country that welcomes more than one religion and that we stand against these things. And if there's anything hopeful that's come out about this whole episode, it is that more and more people are standing against these policies. These policies are seemingly less and less gaining public support or actually losing support. And, I just would hope that more conservatives would speak out against it, not just conservative thinkers. And, I take the fact that Ramesh has been very vocal on this, but it would be wonderful if we could have some of those senators who stood shoulder to shoulder with President Bush stand up right now and say it's wrong.
One quick follow-up about progressive thought and maybe some traditional progressive constituencies. So if we argue that working class, maybe white working class citizens are a traditional progressive constituency, and that set of constituents, voters, is not terribly keen on relaxed immigration rules, apart from the Muslim issue, the religious issue. What kind of challenge does that pose for progressive thinkers to try to, both politically and conceptually, to address the concerns of working class Americans, regardless of ethnicity, concerns about immigration, and these kinds of executive orders, or any restrictions, deportations, how do those come together?
Well, I think we're conflating two things. One, a Muslim ban, and then immigration issues. I appreciate that you're kind of perhaps moving off of one topic to another. But I think if you're asking me broadly about immigration, let me say this. I think that the progressives, the Democratic Party should do better, should try and attract more voters of all stripes. We obviously took significant losses in this election cycle from particularly white non-college voters. Hillary did better with white college voters than any Democrat, but she took huge, Democrat has done recently, but huge significant losses. Having said that, my view of this is that I actually think the work of policymakers should be ones animated by the challenges that we have. And so, is it the case that, I'll say this for myself, I believe Donald Trump campaigned on, anti-immigrant xenophobia. Perhaps that was successful. That does not mean that Democrats or progressives should actually agree to anti-immigrant xenophobia. In fact, that is how countries have gone horribly wrong in the past when the opposition party becomes cowed by political success and does not stand for principle. In my view, we have to do better to answer the questions that are posed by people who are suffering. And I would say if you actually look at the election results in November, the difference between the actual leverage point difference from 2012 to 2016 was not income, but college education. The Hillary, as I said, did much better. She has suffered a negative 28% gap amongst white non-college voters. But I don't think it's an accident. In my view, I don't find it to be an accident that you've seen this big shift between college and non-college voters amongst whites, not amongst people of color, but amongst whites, and that we have an economy in which for 40 years, not 8, not just 16, but for decades, we have not produced significant income gains for people who don't go to college. Now, we should also wrestle with the fact that for people of color, Donald Trump was scary enough that was not the most important issue to them. So I don't think it's all economic to everybody, but I would say that my thumbnail sketch of this election was essentially a kind of wrong answer, in my view, a wrong answer on immigration may trump a kind of convoluted or too complicated answer, and progressives have to have a stronger answer. Now you see Sherrod Brown and other senators speaking out more forcefully on trade. That's definitely an interesting area. But I don't think the answer, and sorry to be long on this, I don't think the answer is to mirror Donald Trump's xenophobia to attract those voters. I think people will see that for what it is, which is giving up on your principles for political victory. And if there's anything I think we've seen in the last election, actually having people think you have core principles is more important.
And on that note, Ramesh, to what extent is the American conservative tradition evolving to encompass or embrace sentiments, I hesitate to say xenophobic, but more nativist, tighter on restriction, certainly less globalist, more inwardly focused? Is that the evolutionary direction of the American conservative movement?
Well, I think you'd have to say right now that that's the case. If you think back to the 1980s and 1990s, support for a relatively open immigration policy was something that was associated with very conservative figures. Jack Kemp running on the right end of the Republican Party in 1988, Steve Forbes in 96 and 2000, and then of course George W. Bush and John McCain were both, I guess, what we now call relatively liberal on immigration policy. But I do think that our immigration policy, like our policy in a lot of areas, taxes being another, it does not look like a system that was designed deliberately. It's a system that sort of grew up almost accidentally and that does need to be rethought. So, for example, if you look at the 2013 bipartisan immigration bill, had 68 senators vote for it, that is a policy that would have doubled immigration levels over the next decade. Much of that immigration would have been low skill. I don't know what the national problem is to which doubling immigration, including a lot of low skilled immigration, is the solution. And I think that there is room to reconsider our policy and move it towards more of a skills basis, possibly reduce the overall numbers. Now, this has to be done, I think, without scapegoating immigrants who are coming here for completely reasonable and legitimate reasons. But I do think that that was a weakness in our immigration policy that created an opening for Donald Trump to use and to exploit.
Yeah, I think I asked the question, is the American conservative tradition evolving this way? In part because one answer might be no, that this kind of nativism and focus on backing off globalism and tightening the borders is really in neither the progressive or conservative tradition, that it's something different. And therefore, progressives are challenged to try to find some kind of answer to it. I guess conservatives, because of the nature of the president, he's a Republican, conservatives face an even bigger challenge in some sense, whether to support this or to back off.
Well, the political valence of anti-immigration sentiment has changed over time. Like if you look at the Barbara Jordan Commission that Bill Clinton appointed in the mid-1990s, a lot of the policies they came up with, including a restriction on the number of immigrants, are things that would fit more on the right today. And I think part of what happened is that the Republican Party became more dependent, even before Trump, on white voters without college degrees who tend to be more anti-immigration. Yeah. And the parties have each sort of shifted in response to the changes in the composition of their political bases.
Yeah, great. If it's okay, I'd like to change gears a little bit, shift gears a little bit to issues of healthcare, and particularly ACA, Affordable Care Act. Just by way of background, I should say that I'm a resident of Massachusetts, and so I experienced something very similar to the ACA in 2006 with Romney Care. So, I think there are a lot of similarities between what was done in Massachusetts and then later the ACA and subsidies and individual mandate and lots of features. And so my question is, since this, at least the Massachusetts variant, was done under a Republican governor who then became the Republican candidate for the presidency in 2012, maybe Neera, I'll begin with you. To what extent is the ACA really reflective of the progressive tradition on healthcare or progressive aspirations on healthcare delivery?
Well, I think it's the progressive, it's an excellent question. I think the theory behind the Affordable Care Act was that you had a progressive goal, which is to get more and more Americans covered, and there were ideas in it that were more centrist. There were ideas in it in its original founding that were more progressive, of a public option. I worked hard on the public option. Maybe it would have more competition if it was actually in the Affordable Care Act, but I think the goal of it was a progressive goal, which is to try to get to near universal coverage. And the fact is that there are millions of people who have health care today only because of it, just like there were millions of people in Massachusetts, or hundreds of thousands of people in Massachusetts who have it just because of that. And what I think is interesting about the debate that we're having now on the Affordable Care Act is how, we as a proponent of the Affordable Care Act and someone who's defended it over the last 7 years, it was hard to get people to support it or focus on it, because the people who liked it were like, it's fine, and the people who really didn't like it were motivated and energized. And now the fact that we're having a debate about actually getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, you have people who have benefited from it coming forward. They're going to town halls, or organizing themselves in Republican districts. Tom McClintock and others this last weekend had hundreds of people in there. And the popularity of the Affordable Care Act is now at the highest it's ever been. It usually was around 48 against, 42 for a long time. Now it's had its highest approval ironically enough, now that it's under assault. So it's hit 50, and I would just note that it's, at this point, dramatically more popular than Trump himself. And so, so I think, I think the assault on it, or the effort to undo it, has actually now shifted the discourse kind of dramatically, so that people are thinking of the benefits, like pre-existing conditions and kids, people under 26 being able to stay on their parents' health care, and people who all throughout this country who would not be able to afford health care but for the Affordable Care Act. And hopefully, maybe out of this all crazy, insane debate we're having over it, we'll actually try and fix some of the problems. There are definitely good senators on both sides in the Senate who are, coming to the place where they would like to fix it rather than destroy it. But, and I think the fact is Republicans right now are wrestling with the fact that it's actually really hard to do healthcare policy. Very easy to have slogans, very hard to do. They have no replacement. Ramesh might be able to provide us an update on what that replacement would look like that would actually pass both houses. But I think the fundamental debate has shifted dramatically.
Ramesh, you're welcome to describe what the replacement looks like, but I won't put you on the spot to do that. I will ask you sort of an analog to the question I asked Neera. From a conservative perspective, what's wrong with it, ACA? Aside, aside from the politics of which president, but fundamentally, what's wrong with the thing?
So I've co-written a 100-page report on what an Obamacare replacement ought to look like, and so I'll now summarize that in detail. How much time? No. Well, Neera's identified some of the obstacles to actually making policy from on the conservative side on this. And the biggest one is that they're actually governing now. They're not just taking pot shots. And the other thing, though, that I think deserves a little highlighting, it seems to me that the central political fact of healthcare for decades has been public fear of disruption in their healthcare arrangements. I think that's what ultimately sank the Clinton attempt to reform healthcare in the mid-1990s. It was how President Obama during the 2008 campaign made a lot of hay, sent $44 million in ads against John McCain because his plan was going to disrupt healthcare. The biggest problem Obamacare had when Obama was president was those cancellations of plans. And now this is a problem for the Republican replacement attempts. That how do you do it without threatening the benefits that people already have? I think there are ways to do that, but that would run up, actually doing that would run up against yet another constraint, and another problem is that it would require Republicans to think about health care. And as I've been working on this over the years, there's a real resistance to that. Republican politicians are willing to do just about anything to stop Obamacare except think about health care.
Is it a philosophical resistance? In other words, the kind of get your government fingers out of my life. That's a reasonable philosophical position. Is that what really is driving?
Yeah, but it's not like they want to get rid of Medicare. I mean, we can argue about that. They don't want to get rid of Medicaid. They don't want to get rid of the tax break for employer-provided health insurance.
Is that next issue? Because there are definitely the people who'd like to. So I'm happy to move on to that.
There are those of us who would like to modernize Medicare. That is true. But this gets back to the question of sort of what is, that you asked, sort of what from a conservative point of view is wrong about Obamacare. And it seems to me what's wrong about it is not that it subsidized people so that they could get access to health insurance. That, it seems to me, is something we have been doing for decades, just not in a terribly efficient or rational way, through things like Medicare, Medicaid, and that tax break for employer-provided health insurance. The problem, from my standpoint at least, is that the model of a national healthcare system that Obamacare embodies is much too regulatory and much too focused on comprehensive health insurance, doesn't allow enough room for catastrophic health insurance that would enable people to protect themselves against the risk of a major financial setback that's related to healthcare. That, it seems to me, is much of the actual value of health insurance. And it's something that we've had various government policies that for decades have made a robust market in renewable catastrophic policies hard to sustain. And Obamacare has, in some ways, made that problem worse. What I would like to see is a shift towards a new healthcare system where we continue to facilitate people's ability to get at least catastrophic coverage and more if they decide to make that trade-off between premiums, deductibles, and co-pays, but that doesn't put the federal government in the role of being the chief regulator of health insurance. Whether they're going to get there is a very different question.
So I think that within Ramesh's answer, you see the kind of central challenge that Republicans have and that policymakers have writ large. If you ask people today and you actually look at what Trump said during the campaign about the ACA, about Obamacare, his attack on it was that it was too expensive. Premiums were too high, costs were too high, they're out of control, they're crazy, blah, 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 whatever word he wanted to use that day. And that is actually the concern a lot of people have, which is that costs are too high, premiums are too high, and not affordable enough. Ramesh is absolutely right. There is a strain of conservatives who have argued health policy for many, many years, who have argued that the best way to address the problems in the healthcare system is to treat it like a normal market. What does that mean? It means that individuals bear the costs of healthcare, so they internalize the cost, so they're better healthcare consumers. And so the idea of what Ramesh and Bryce has a version of this is catastrophic coverage in which you have gigantic deductibles and you bear the costs unless you're in a hospitalization. So essentially, like routine doctors things, you pay yourself. Now, the vast majority of Americans don't think of that as insurance. They think of that as not really insurance. And one of the problems in the ACA, one could argue, is that it's almost like it's catastrophic coverage today for too many people. So I think the central challenge we have amongst Republicans today is that there's 5 million Trump voters, 5 million people who voted for Trump who are on the ACA. If you ask them what their concerns are and what they thought when they were voting for him, they'll say, I believed him that he would give me something better. I would get terrific care. They thought their costs would go down. They thought the paperwork would go down. They thought the premiums would go down, not up. And yet, Price and Ramesh's view is that we should offer something, and that is the dominant view. We should offer something in which costs go up for people. Essentially, you bear more of the cost. The government bears less of the cost. Individuals bear more of the cost. It is a consistent view of many conservatives. It is just not what a lot of people think. And when they actually complain about the Affordable Care Act, they think it's too expensive for people. It's not that it's too little expense for people. And so I think that is, now, there's Ramesh's view. There's a whole group of people who don't, within the House Republican caucus, the Freedom Caucus, who want to get rid of the Medicaid expansion. There are a whole group of people who think the government should do nothing on healthcare and just tear up the ACA and do nothing. And I want to applaud Ramesh for being one of the few people. I don't agree with him, but he does actually believe that we should do something in this space. And then there's a lot of people who relied on Trump's promises. And so I think those three issues are swirling around, and the challenge is that when you are president and you govern, you have to make a call. You have to get a majority, or in the Senate, 60 votes behind something. I worked on the Affordable Care Act. It was a nightmare. I'll just say it. Like, work out all these details, get people together. There's lots of ugly things that you have to do. And the problems Republicans have is that they said repeal and replace for 7 years. They had 7 years to come up with an agreement about what the replacement was, but it was always easier to have a slogan than govern, and that is why I think the chances that they will actually accomplish this task in the next month or two are slim to none.
Maybe we can shift gears just a little bit again. We're covering a lot of ground, and I'll open it up in just a few minutes to all of you. I want to shift to issues of gender and reproductive rights. So maybe, Ramesh, we'll start with you. I think it's fair to argue that pro-life position has now become an inviolable tenet of American conservatism. And the question I have is twofold. One, where exactly does that come from in the conservative tradition, the sanctity of the pro-life position? And then related to that, to what extent can other issues surrounding gender rights, gender equality, access to reproductive health, health care, are those separable, and how can they be separable from a conservative perspective from a pro-life position?
Well, I think that the liberalism, conservatism, the Democratic and Republican parties have all ideologically sorted themselves on the abortion issue in a way that, let me put it this way. If you were a very far-sighted political observer in 1965, you might have been able to predict that abortion would become this huge flashpoint in American politics, but you might not have predicted which party would take which position, right? You might have thought the party that is traditionally the party of Catholics, the Democratic Party, would be on the pro-life side, and the party that was traditionally actually the party of Planned Parenthood, the Republican Party, would be on the other side, and the parties actually really flipped on that. And to the extent that now, whereas as recently as the 1980s, there was a substantial number of pro-life Democrats, there was a substantial number of pro-choice Republicans, and there's really nothing on either side. I mean, you've got voters on both sides, but the organized groups, the politicians, are all lined up on one side or the other. I do think that, as many things as Trump was able to violate in terms of conservative orthodoxy, as many things as he was able to advertise that he didn't care about sort of existing conservative principles, if he had not staked out the pro-life position, however conveniently, he would not have been able to win the nomination. And and you couldn't win the Democratic nomination running as, like Bob Casey Sr., or probably even Bob Casey Jr., running on a relatively pro-life position. And I suppose, in a way, I myself am pro-life, and I think it is a natural, though not inevitable, fit with conservative views about the sanctity of individuals and individual rights. But of course, that's what makes it such a neuralgic issue, is that you can view it from the perspective of individual rights on either side. Right. And party coalitions tend to form and then come up with arguments that make everything fit together rather than the other way around.
Right, and again, Neera, I would ask a little bit an analog, so from a progressive tradition where pro-choice is central, to what extent is the pro-choice position also separable or inseparable from other positions on gender rights, gender equality? I mean, it comes to mind because of the experience at the Women's March, where you had groups who were pro-life but perhaps were excluded, or at least claimed they were excluded. So how, from a progressive perspective, over the long run, will the pro-choice position and other gender issues be negotiated?
I agree with Ramesh that these issues have become kind of central on both sides. If you looked at the presidential debates, both candidates staked out, kind of the clearest articulation of their views on this issue. What I think is interesting, or kind of a fascinating trend that I'm seeing, or just what I'm seeing in relationship to Trump, is that unlike other candidates or other political leaders, he has made gender issues, both consciously and unconsciously, front and center in the debate. I mean, I'll just say, I am a leader of progressive organizations. We talked about a lot of rallies in November and December. There was a giant immigration rally planned, a lot of ACA rallies on January 15th, and then the Women's March. And, actually, the January 15th healthcare rallies, we had 12,000 people in Warren, Michigan. No, like when we're actually passing the ACA, we couldn't get 1,000 people in Warren, Michigan. But now, you know, so it's like no joke of the size of that. But the Women's March, I mean, CAP was a sponsor of the Women's March. We had an optimistic sense. Like our optimistic sense was that we were going to get 200,000 people on the mall. We got, I believe, at least 600,000 people. I mean, it was amazing. And you could tell it was overwhelmed because the speakers were like in this corner, and like most of the people couldn't even see the speakers. And there was marches, you know, obviously all around the country, largest marches people have seen in Alaska and Montana and other states. So, you know, people would like to call it a coastal phenomenon, but it's not just that. And I think actually, you know, issues around gender are cascading throughout not only what Trump is doing, but the opposition to Trump. There was a great Washington Post article about how women are becoming more engaged politically than they ever have. Women are leading the opposition. More women are taking political action than they've ever taken before. Men are doing more too. But more women are leading more women are taking more action. And I think that is a kind of psychological response to the election itself. I think a lot of women woke up on November 9th and saw that a person who went through the entire campaign and obviously bragged about sexual assault, let's just be honest about it, became president of the United States and saw that as a psychological wound. I know a lot of women who did, and I think that is that is part and parcel of the opposition that's being created in the country. I will say, you know, I've been in politics, and I've been in definitely democratic and progressive politics for 20 years now. I have never seen this level of political mobilization. And just as an example, I mean, we obviously went through an incredibly divisive debate about the Iraq War. We never got 600,000 people on the mall. You know, President Bush had a very unpopular war, and he had and then he had obviously Katrina, a whole host of events. People organized about those things, but you never saw this level of mobilization. Obviously, never this level of mobilization this early. And it's weekend after weekend after weekend. I think we will see more of this. I think the February 20th town halls. The next recess is February 20th. It's a week of recess for Congress. People are now sharing town hall dates and information around the country, and I think you'll see more political mobilization. To come back to your question, I think that in many ways, I mean, obviously, like Trump has like 3 women in the cabinet. No Republican has had fewer women. His policies definitely do not seem targeted towards women in a way that, you know, George Bush, other Republicans have been much more focused on you know, attracting both men and women, and policies have talked about equal pay, other issues, tried to elide the gender differences instead of make them starker. And I think that's actually affecting politics and political discourse and I think it'll do it for years to come.
I have not coincidentally, a final question that has to do with exactly the point you just made and mobilization. So it seems to me that, you know, in 2009, whatever, the Tea Party really got going, and the Tea Party represented a kind of political mobilization effort that was insurgent in a way. There's not a value laden, but just an insurgency against the Republican Party establishment, and then a movement that proved quite successful in presidential politics and congressional politics. And now, in progressive circles, it seems with the spread of Indivisible, that document, that there's an effort to mirror that strategy of mobilization. So just the last question I have for you both is, have we entered a new era of insurgency? Is that what politics is really going to look like? Is it going to be Tea Party politics pretty much in both parties and playing out in the next congressional round and elections and ultimately the next presidential election? Ramesh?
Well, you know, as far back as the 1830s, you know, Tocqueville writes Democracy in America, and he talks about how the United States goes mad during presidential elections. There's this feverishness surrounding the election. That sort of matches my experience having covered elections from 96 onward. There's a real difference this time in that the fever didn't break, that people are still revved up in a way that they weren't in, say, February of 2001, even though you had a Republican president who had been elected having lost the popular vote. It just feels completely different, the degree of mobilization that we have right now. And a couple things strike me about this. One is that there's a lot of negative polarization, that you've got two large coalitions that are united by their hostility to each other more than they are to anything positive about their own political leadership. And then the second thing is that in both sides, there's this kind of conceit of representing the people. And you really see this with Trump. Trump's version of populism is to present himself as reflecting and in some way even embodying the popular will. And that's why the fact that he lost the popular vote seems to drive him nuts. The fact that his inaugural crowds were not as big as the marchers against him also seems to drive him nuts. And it's very dangerous, I think, in a president to have that mindset, because if you think you speak for the people, then your opponents are the enemies of the people. Right? That's not a good mindset for the leader of a pluralistic
Do you
democracy.
read his tweets?
To
he
have.
definitely thinks that.
Yeah, so he does think that. But I do think that it's one thing to draw these huge crowds in opposition to him, but it would be a mistake to think that the opposition therefore represents or speaks for the people. Both sides are really actually unpopular. There are overlapping majorities against each side, and you were talking about mobilization, and mobilization is an important part of politics, but it strikes me that both sides now are much, much more focused on mobilization than they are on persuasion, and that is a recipe for continued dysfunctional politics, I think.
Great. Neera?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I fundamentally agree. I guess what I would say is that it's not clear to me, like, where the energy is coming from. I mean, I think one could argue that this opposition is just, no one puts their pitchforks down after an election, or you could say that it was a very polarized election, and we had a chance of lock her up. People said that Trump was deranged.
And there was shock on the losing side.
Yeah, definitely a shock on the losing, and it was an unusual loss because you have, the popular vote, the largest differential between the popular vote and the Electoral College in our history. Having said that, I do think that if Trump had sort of done the things George Bush did post-election, throughout that period, he might have the kind of popularity. I mean, if you look back to George Bush's popularity at this point, he was like close to 60%, and he'd lost the popular vote by 500,000 and had a much shakier grasp of the Electoral College. And I think that's putting it politely. And so he put a Democrat in his administration, consistently called Democrats, had them over, didn't tweet Schumer clowns or Schumer's a loser, and consistently, and I think really tried to make a different kind of effort. Now, it may well have been that Democrats are so polarized about his policies, and things like the Muslim ban kind of proves them right. I think the theory of the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration, and they're backgrounding this with reporters, is to do so many things so quickly that they overwhelm the opposition, or at least that was a theory until the Muslim ban ran into so many problems. But I think what ended up happening is that they have galvanized an opposition. You are absolutely right that there is not a lot of love for leaders. But what I think is actually energizing, we obviously had a really divisive debate in our primary over the last year in the Democratic primary. But I think what's really energizing people now is not where you were you a Bernie supporter or a Hillary supporter, but are you willing to stand up to Trump on the Democratic side? Because people see such a fundamental affront to their values from the Muslim ban, from just the way he treats the press by attacking the judiciary. I have to say, amongst progressives, people are like, this is an assault on democracy. Not just an argument about, how much we should spend on education or what our tax policy should be, but these are the attacks on the press, the attacks on the judiciary are seen as the attacks on the checks and some of the checks that would occur to presidential powers run amok. And I think, you see voices on the right who have been the traditional proponents of limited government also recognize some of that concern. And so I think amongst progressives today, it's not, it's not an ideological debate about, whether we should have $12 minimum wage or $15 minimum wage. I hope one day we get to that, but we're having sort of existential questions now about who is an American, whether people who we previously thought were American are welcome as Americans, and really fundamental questions about what kind of government we have and whether we have a judiciary we respect that's a check or not. And so I think that's actually uniting a broad cascade of progressives, whether they'll how they'll figure out involvement in the next election or whether it'll come up with a consistent platform. But right now it's very much harnessed is against what Trump stands for. And I think you're seeing people, I go to protests too, and I now see people, I'm struck by the number of people who are like, I've never been to a march in my life. I came to this because I see, I disagree with what's going on.
Yeah. Let's open it up to you all in the audience. There are microphones on both sides of both aisles. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come on down. Yes.
Yes,
And,
hi.
and say who you are, please.
Brad Brockman from the Center for Prisoner Health and Human Rights here at Brown and also at the School of Public Health. My question is for Mr. Ponnuru. You mentioned that you want to see in the context of healthcare reform more catastrophic coverage and things that I would classify more as middle class concerns. We have two major problems in the United States that we actually also have some significant bipartisan agreement on traditionally. The opioid overdose epidemic and the addiction epidemic, which is tied in directly also to the epidemic of incarceration in the country, which is also a specific function of the traditional historical failure to provide health care for low-income individuals. We have traditionally provided health care from women, mothers, children, and the disabled, but
And
not for
elderly.
the poor qua poor. The question then is, how do we solve a problem that is fundamentally a function of the failure to provide low-income coverage for the poor, for low-income individuals who are being pushed into where the only option they have potentially for care is in their local prisons and jails. That is until Obamacare came along, on the one hand. On the other hand, well, just to throw in that this is tied directly into Trump's support in low-income communities with declining life expectancies tied to their overdose rates,
Let's let the
suicide
panel
rates.
answer.
So-
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, and I think there have been some studies that suggest that the communities where the opioid epidemic has really ravaged those places were more likely to vote for Trump. Of course, there's a lot of other things going on, and there's, how much is deindustrialization contributing to the opioid epidemic and so forth. So there's a kind of a knotty set of issues. On healthcare, and particularly healthcare for poor people, I think that what we ought to do is allow the non-elderly, non-disabled portion of the Medicaid population to receive their Medicaid money in the form of an additional tax credit that they could add on to the regular tax credit that everybody should be. But this would be money, right? And then you could use it to buy insurance on the private market that is superior in quality to Medicaid, which has look, the difference in physical health outcomes between people on Medicaid and people who have no health insurance at all have been extremely hard for researchers to actually find. And I think we can do better by these populations by moving to a different model where the market, it's a less segregated market.
I mean, just to answer that, I mean, the challenge with Medicaid is that it's hard for me to buy the criticism of conservatives that Medicaid is not generous enough when conservatives have basically, at the state level, in many states, have made the program so puny that that's why it's not better than private insurance. The answer to that is not to throw people on private insurance in the individual market, which is far more expensive than Medicaid itself. It is to actually do a reimbursement level at Medicaid, which would make it more like Medicare, which would make it a good enough healthcare plan for people. And I think the essential fact here is that just going back to the original debate on healthcare is that we can't, the good thing about the debate that Congress is having right now is that it can't argue out of both sides of its mouth. It can't attack the ACA for being not generous enough or too expensive, but then come out with a plan that actually puts more costs on people. They're gonna have to own the decisions they make. You're absolutely right about the opioid crisis and the fact that a lot of that has been, there are a lot of reasons that people there is an opioid crisis, but one of the things that has been helpful to address it is the Medicaid expansion. And the tragedy of American policy over the last couple of years, one of the most tragic elements is that, if you're middle class, you can get the ACA subsidies, but if you're poor, it just matters what state you're in, because some states won't do it and some states will, and we have study after study that the Medicaid expansions are actually helping address the opioid crisis, and that is why some conservative-leaning Democrats like Joe Manchin have been strong proponents of the ACA, because it's actually doing something in that state, and that's why we should actually not rip it apart. And I would just say once again, there are lots of people who voted for Trump who are on the ACA, but conservatives have to remember that those voters believed him when he said, now I don't know why they did, but they did believe him when he said they would get something better. Not something worse, not something nothing, something better. And they are relying on that promise. We've done focus groups with them. We're like, if he doesn't do it, we'll vote everyone out. And so, we thought it was all ridiculous when he said, oh, it's going to be terrific care. But they believed him. And so I think conservatives take it at their peril, that they think, oh, these people voted for him, so they're all fine with whatever we do. They are not. They want something cheaper, not more expensive.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Dave Andrews. I'm a high school social studies teacher up in Woonsocket.
Oh, great.
I believe our problems go far beyond Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. I'm concerned about the effects of neoliberalism on the U.S. and on the world. What do you both think the impact of neoliberalist ideology will be under the Trump administration, with sweeping proposals for deregulation and decreased government? Who will hold entities like Wall Street, the banks, and the petrochemical industry accountable? And will the wealth gap accelerate and widen under the Trump administration?
Yes.
Ramesh?
I mean, I'll just be very quick on this. I mean, I will say, if you actually look at the ads that were run, and they were run, like Trump ran very few ads, and he did his largest ad buy in the last 10 days of the election. And it was, I kind of freaked out ad, but obviously very effective. His ad had two villains, lobbyists and Wall Street. I mean, it was also kind of anti-Semitic, but it was he definitely, he pictured Lloyd Blankfein, Janet Yellen, who was the third? Paul Krugman? I felt like I'm missing somebody. But he had a vicious...
George Soros. It must have been
George
Soros.
Soros. It was George
It's
Soros.
always
Yes,
George Soros.
It's always George A vicious assault. His rhetoric was a vicious assault on the powers of Wall Street, right? I do not think that people would, I mean, if you look at those ads, you'd be surprised to know within a few just short weeks of those ads, he would have 6 Goldman Sachs folks in the administration. I mean, he viciously attacked Hillary during the debates as a tool of Wall Street, and then has Gary Cohn in his White House. So I see that. I agree with Bernie Sanders about this. This is like the giant bait and switch. There were a lot of populist economic voters who thought that they were getting, you know, a person who is like who attacked Wall Street, saw its failures. I mean, he would say this in the Republican and Democratic debates. And yet, I think we're going to get the most kind of traditionally conservative, undo Dodd-Frank, undo regulations writ large, a tax plan that will do more than any tax plan in history to favor the wealthy if it's actually his plan. I mean, this is a situation in which Paul Ryan is operating as a block on the inequality that he would provide, which is hard to fathom. So you know, I think that if people bought that rhetoric, and there were 8% of Bernie Sanders supporters who voted for Donald Trump. Now that's like small, that's not a lot, but there were some. Many voted third party, thinking that like they're all corrupt, and now we have Donald Trump.
I think that it's unfair to describe this as a cabinet of Goldman Sachs execs. There's also generals. So it's
No,
actually
it's not only Goldman
it's
Sachs.
balanced.
I totally agree. It's not only Goldman Sachs.
Look, I think some of the regulatory action from this administration might end up being good. I think that some, like having a congressional vote on major regulation, for example, is good. That we shouldn't continue to have a situation where Congress continually passes the buck, and all the negative effects of regulations are things they say, oh, that's some agency with an alphabet.
There's no vote
label.
on the Muslim ban.
I'm sorry, what?
There's no vote on the Muslim ban.
Well, right, that's right, but that sort of gets back to the same point, which is that you need to have Congress rather than the president doing all these things unilaterally. And in fact, the places where Trump is most problematic are places where where a president can act unilaterally. There's a lot of things that Congress won't stop that Congress wouldn't have actually done on its own if their input had been required. I do think that what you're calling the bait and switch is probably the biggest political vulnerability that the Trump administration is going to have going forward. That if you really, that his opponents, the thing they should really concentrate on is, you promised this, you gave us this. And if tax policy takes the form that you're talking about, if they just pass a repeal of Obamacare and don't do anything to take care of the people who benefited from Medicaid expansion or benefited from the exchanges, then I think that there's going to be a very solid case, and it's going to hurt Republicans up and down the ticket.
If Republicans are hurt, is it conceivable that the strategy from the president is international conflict? So push conflict, push an external enemy in order to deal with the potential problem of a bait and switch domestically?
Well, he is an unpredictable man in some respects, and that is possible. It's also possible that he just washes his hands of these congressional Republicans and decides, you know, you guys, that's your problem. You go win your races. I've still got my solid 37% of the public that's, I still get to be in the Oval Office. And
Yeah, I mean, if Republicans lose, I think he's just going to call them losers.
Yeah.
I don't know that he's actually going to be like, it's on me.
And every Republican on Capitol Hill
Knows
is
that.
aware
They know
that he can turn on them on a dime.
I mean, one of the things that actually I think is one of the challenges for governing and for coming up with a solution on the ACA is that Republicans have no trust that when things go bad, he'll defend them. He'll just attack them. Like they didn't
exactly support him when he was running.
No, but a lot of the people, I mean, so when you look
And it's going to be a problem in his administration as well.
when you have 5%, so 5% of voters went Obama, Trump, 3% of voters went Romney, Clinton. 5% of voters who went Obama-Trump, you know, a lot of those people are like, he's not really a Republican because he attacks Republicans. I mean, I think he thinks that and I think House Republicans, Senate Republicans, you know, he has a very strong hold on a majority of the party, so that's a challenge for them. But also he has, you know, he's stronger in the party than they are. So like if he, you know, I mean, everyone's a little, you can speak to this more than I can, obviously, but I think a lot of Republicans are worried about just like one tweet about crossing him, and then
It's
know,
like the
they're
Eye
like,
of Sauron. They don't want it focused on them through the
yeah,
Twitter.
so that's why people who, you know, will say Betsy DeVos is like not actually, should not actually, I mean, people behind closed doors will say, you know, she didn't really show that she should be nominee, whatever, you know, they'll still vote for her because they're worried about, you know, the ire. But, you know, I mean, that is a problem for governing because you sometimes need to make tough political calls where you have to have cover from your president, and it makes it hard to come up with solutions.
The challenge of working, if you're a congressional Republican, the challenge is that this president is both sort of thinks of himself as a strongman, but it's actually a very weak presidency. And both of those things create problems for them.
I mean, the one thing I would say about, you know, I definitely worry about some kind of international crisis or something. I think what happened in the Yemen attack, though, is actually very instructive, which is that, you know, there are forces within the government, obviously forces in the military, who were like going to dime out what really happened. And so I don't, you know, and that never happened. I mean, there were definitely people in the military who kind of disagreed fundamentally with Barack Obama on policy, but they never actually leaked out that he was at a dinner or doing something with his political associates when he was supposed to be making, like in the Situation Room. The fact that I mean, I thought it was very instructive that leaked out and that the military clearly was like, this, you know, if you're gonna blame us or whatever you're gonna do, we're gonna tell the truth.
You know, and one more thing on that, I am less worried that Trump will, you know, have some kind of wag the dog scenario where he's deliberately starts a foreign conflict to distract from something going on.
He might not deliberately do it.
I am more worried about blundering into something because of erratic and uncoordinated decision making.
Yeah, so just to have people really not sleep it well tonight. You know, in the South China Sea, we're actually in a situation where there's, you know, our military and the Chinese military come into close quarters of each other relatively often. We're basically policing international waters that there is a fundamental dispute over who owns. Now, I think China's totally wrong about this, but there is a dispute about those waters, and our military, our jets, our ships kind of come in contact with each other. The challenge is that there are very few forces within China itself that allow it to decelerate a conflict. And now, if there's a conflict, we have to decide whether, we have to have a sense of whether Donald Trump can decelerate a conflict, which, you know, I find hard to believe.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm a senior concentrating in math and computer science. My question is for both of you, but mainly for Ramesh. So as more and more jobs are being lost to automation, do you believe that white working class voters and conservative voters and people without college degrees will support social programs such as basic income and the ACA or variants of the ACA?
Well, you know, automation, it's very important to note that a lot of the campaign rhetoric has been about job losses to trade, but automation has actually done more to reduce manufacturing employment in our country. That, in fact, our manufacturing output is as strong as it's ever been. The reason manufacturing employment's gone down is because we can produce more with fewer people. And this is an example of Trump, and not only Trump, making promises about jobs coming back that just can't conceivably be made good on. As to sort of what happens then, when you've got a group of disillusioned and alienated voters become further disillusioned, I don't know. It seems to me that the universal basic income is probably not what results from that, but I'm not sure where they go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to just say one thing about universal basic income, which is that I guess I would just say my view of this is that if you look at what's happening in the elections, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, I think policymakers tend to undervalue the value people place in actually the dignity of work. And I think a lot of voters were angry. A lot of voters were angry that essentially the job they had hasn't kept up with inflation or hasn't produced what it produced in the past. And I don't think, this is just me, but I don't think if you asked a kind of 50-year-old, man, like, would you like a check for $40,000 or a job that pays $50,000? I think like 99% of people, the economists will say, a job that pays $35,000 is the same. I mean, a check for $35,000 is the same as a job that pays $50,000 because you have all this free time and blah, 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 blah. But I think like most humans would like the dignity of work. And, I think that it is not an accident that in my view, that that this election, again, was so fought out with college versus non-college voters, at least amongst whites. And this economy has done well for decades for people. Today, if you have a college education, your unemployment rate is about 2 to 3%. If you don't go to college, it's multitudes of that. And your income and your ability to stay, to keep up with standard of living is just much harder if you don't go to college. If you look at the chart of America, like where you've seen growth, particularly over the last years, is cities all throughout the country, cities in Michigan, cities in Ohio, there has been growth. And the places that are seeing negative growth are rural exurbans, and that's like the big difference in the election. And I think the truth is progressives, Trump is now in power. I do not think he's going to have a gigantic answer to this problem in America. People will continue to get angry, and I think it's up to progressives, too, to come up with a better answer for those folks so that we have, I don't know if it's universal basic income or it's some giant WPA program or something else.
Well, I think the president will work with you on the giant WPA program.
It's interesting. It's so interesting. We were on another panel where we had the similar discussion. The idea that he started with healthcare instead of infrastructure is like fascinating to me. He should have started with infrastructure, but I guess they wouldn't let him.
But he doesn't set the agenda.
Yeah.
He sees something on Morning Joe and then he intervenes. That is the model of presidential leadership that he's adopted.
Let's take a question from this side.
Hi, I'm Jay. I'm a sophomore concentrating in computational biology and computer science. So I have two questions, actually, somewhat related to the previous one. The first one for Mr. Ponnuru and the second one for Ms. Tanden. Mr. Ponnuru, Donald Trump has advocated during and after the election cycle more and more isolationist trade policies. To me, these policies seem like a ploy to promise a segment of voters of the manufacturing sector that they'll get their jobs back, which in reality, as you mentioned, are being lost more to technology than to being shipped overseas. So how do these isolationist policies fit into the broader conservative ideology? And also, Ms. Tanden, do progressive ideals support higher taxes on multinational corporations in the United States? And if so, what incentive does this give for these corporations to centralize production in the United States in an increasingly global economy?
Thanks.
So-
Time's running short, so we'll
Sure, I'll try to be
Thanks.
succinct. I don't think that Trump's protectionism is a ploy. I think this is one of the few consistent beliefs about public policy that he has held over the decades. I think he's ill-informed and dead wrong on it, and I hope conservatism rejects his views, but I think he's deadly serious about it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and corporate taxes, this is the broad challenge about corporate taxes, which is there's a race to the bottom amongst countries, just like there's a race to the bottom on corporate taxes amongst states. So, over the long term, what we really need to do is to have a global agreement on some minimum taxes, or you will always get an Ireland that will just basically cut its taxes to get Apple. Now the European Union is actually going after that level of abuse, but if it's not Ireland, it'll be some other country on the globe. So you're absolutely right that you do face essentially this race to the bottom, and that I don't think the answer to that is to say what really needs to happen is that corporate taxes, we just need to match Ireland's taxes. I think we need to have a global agreement about that. But I think, but I do take the point that absent that, companies are just moving around. What's fascinating to me about Trump is he has adopted the kind of progressive argument, which is that companies that do this, that leave, they pick up and go over, are, bad, or not acting in the interests of the United States. That is an argument that like progressives have made. He's just going to attack them on Twitter and elsewhere as a response.
Short questions, please. Go ahead.
So I'd like to hear from both of you about your opinions on the responses of members of Congress to everything that's happening. Ramesh, I'd like to hear from you about so far how Republican members of Congress have responded. The word that's been used a lot is spineless. I would tend to agree. And Neera, I'd like to hear from you about
Spineless for Democrats too. So
yeah, I'd like to. I'd like to hear from you about how Democrats in Congress should respond. There's a big progressive push to obstruct. And while I tend to agree with that, because abnormal circumstances call for abnormal actions, I also do worry about the deterioration of a functioning government and continuing to solidify dangerous precedents that were actually started by the Tea Party, but that really hurt relationships across party lines in Congress.
Thanks. Ramesh?
I actually think, don't laugh, that the Republican Congress has been a little bit of a check on Trump in a kind of passive and invisible way.
Except for Lindsey Graham and John McCain.
Let
What are
Ramesh answer, please.
Because, look,
I have done all I can not to laugh out.
thank you, Neera. Just in the sense that it seems to me that in general and with exceptions, the caliber of the Senate confirmable people that he has put up is higher than the caliber of the people he's put up for non-Senate confirmed positions. A lot of the people he's putting up for the cabinet are people who any Republican president would have put up, whereas Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and a bunch of these other, and Sean Spicer, they wouldn't have a role in a different Republican administration. And I think that reflects the fact that they worry about 2 or 3 defections among Senate Republicans. That said, I think that just as a lot of Democrats were shocked by the election result, and that's one reason why that people have taken to the streets, I think a lot of Republicans were also shocked by the election results. And as a result, Trump looms larger for Republicans than he otherwise would, given has actually fairly low percentage of the vote. My hope/thought is that as the election gets further into our rearview mirror, that there becomes that effect fades, and that in this respect, the normalization of Trump actually works against him because congressmen start to reassert themselves, and any Congress, they start disliking getting bossed around by the White House, even if it's the same party, and I suspect that over time that's going to happen.
So I think on Democrats, I hope you're right about Republicans. I tend to be less optimistic, but with Democrats, I think the challenge is it's a little bit of a mirror image, but not exactly the same. So I was at the Senate Democratic retreat, and people were like, "What's this was after the march." And it was after Senator Brown, Sherrod Brown, and Elizabeth Warren voted for Ben Carson, who I might just disagree that Ben Carson is like a great nominee who deserves to be heading a cabinet agency.
I thought it was crazy that Elizabeth Warren voted for him. I was like,
Yeah, so here's the thing. I think this is and there was a lot of anger about that because, why would you vote for him? And I think the issue here is for a lot of progressives, a lot of Democrats, they do not see Donald Trump as a normal president. And every day he answers that, he fortifies that, and over the weekend, attacking the so-called judge. And just his rhetoric writ large against all kinds of institutions. As I said, he, won in a very divisive way, has not actually functioned as a normal president. He thinks that's what motivates his base, But the rest, Democrats look at this and say, like, danger Will Robinson. And I think the challenge is for a lot of Democratic senators, they have a playbook of what you do with the president. Like a normal president, you defer to their, and they're angry that like Obama was treated so shabbily. And so in their mind, you defer and like pick, et cetera. Whereas the base is like, why are you agreeing to these crazy nominees? And I think you're seeing with the march and the protests and the town halls, there's an energy out there. Democratic Senate leaders are not leading that energy. They're observing it, but they're also recognizing, and they're seeing, I spoke with a bunch of senators yesterday at this Davos rally, and they were shocked by his attack on the judge. I don't know why they were shocked, but it is making them think like this is not a normal debate we're having. We're not having a normal debate about tax policy, a normal debate about healthcare. We're having a debate about democracy itself and the institutions of democracy, and it calls for greater opposition than it otherwise would. And you're seeing they're going to hold the floor basically for nights on end this week in order to slow down. Democrats got rid of the filibuster for cabinet appointments, so they don't have the ability to stop them, but they are going to hold the line, and you'll see a bunch of votes which will be entirely party lines, which you have people from all the way over here from Joe Manchin to Bernie Sanders agreeing to oppose both DeVos and Price, which is relatively unprecedented.
We are unfortunately out of time, so my apologies to the other questioners, but I truly want to thank both of you, Ramesh, Neera. I want to thank you for your insights, of course, your honesty, and I mentioned academic freedom at the beginning of the talk. Your willingness to listen to each other, listen to the questions, really, I thought, was a model for all of us about how discourse should take place. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.